Well, Mission Hills, it's so great to see y'all. It's good to be back. I haven't been here for a few months, and so it is really good to be back with y'all here and to dive in and to join you. I love what God is doing here through the ministries, and of course, the sports ministry is near and dear to my heart, but the way that we're investing in the lives of young people is pretty incredible. So thank you for being a church that engages the lives of others. You know, as we dive in today, there is a series that Pastor Craig has been leading us through. It's been a narrative through this Old Testament prophet named Elijah. And I will say, today's passage is literally one of my favorite passages in all of the scriptures. So when we were planning out the different weeks, I originally didn't have this passage. And then a couple weeks ago, as we were redoing the schedule, I looked and I saw, oh man, I get to do 1 Kings chapter 18, and I love it. So I'm excited about today because I think it's going to expose a whole lot. It's exposed a whole lot in my life. I think it'll expose a whole lot in your lives as well. And you may think, well, that's not a good thing, but trust me, it is a good thing. And what we're going to really talk about, we're going to talk about this idea of worship. And here's one of the greatest questions that we can ask ourselves, or that somebody can ask us, is who or what do you worship? And I know even right now, I may have lost some people because they're like, well, I don't worship. Like, I'm not even a Christian. I'm just here. Somebody made me come, or I've just got a few questions, or I'm listening online and someone's listening really loud. I don't actually worship anything. But I want us to really think a little bit deeper about this, because if you're a living and breathing person, which I'm assuming everybody here is, if you're a living and breathing person, you worship something. Like, we all worship. That's how we're designed. Our hearts gravitate towards worship. But to truly understand what we worship or who we worship, we've got to peel back the layers on what worship really is, because actually who or what we worship is really important. But a deeper question is, why do we worship that person? Why do we worship that being? Why do we worship that thing? Because the reason it's so important is because our lives will start to be modeled after the things that we worship. If we start to worship different things, then our lives start to become like those things that we find ourselves worshiping. Everybody worships. You see, we worship things that make us feel like our feelings, our needs need to be met. And so we worship things outside of ourselves for those needs to be met. And so every one of us have needs. So every one of us look to something outside of ourselves to help meet those needs. And in that case, everybody in this room, everyone listening right now, we all have a tendency to worship. Even The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, he has something that he worships. Some of you recognize Dwayne Johnson here in this picture. You've seen his movies, you've seen his shows, you've seen him in sporting events. He's the face of Under Armour, this fitness and athletic brand. And there was a commercial that made the rounds about a year ago about Dwayne Johnson. And this commercial really centered around his workout routine. And I just want to take out just a couple of lines, a couple of things that he said. When I was watching TV and I saw this commercial, I was like, man, that right there says a whole lot about this thing called worship. Listen to what he says. He says this in this Under Armour commercial. He says, look, is it just a bar, cold steel, and an empty gym? No, it is much more than that. I don't just load these bars with metal plates. I put everything on them. My anxieties, my fears, my hopes, my dreams, my responsibilities as a provider, a father, a husband, a businessman, and some say even a leader. Like, in a lot of ways, that actually sounds really good. Like, it is really good. Like, that all sounds good and dandy. And look, I don't know Dwayne Johnson. I don't know his motives for what he does or why he does what he does. But I'm curious what's under the surface, because did you catch some of the things that he said? That for him, working out, lifting weights, it's not just about being healthy, that it brings him a sense of security, a sense of peace, a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. That the God of the fitness bar actually bears the weight of his life's needs. You know, Dwayne Johnson's gym is called Iron Paradise. He's got 3 of them. One of them is actually a traveling gym that goes with him wherever he's filming, whether in the States or around the world. It's over 40,000 pounds of equipment. It's got to be moved around with multiple 18-wheelers. and literally takes hundreds of people to set it up. And it's got to be set up just the right way to create the right environment for him to be able to work out. Like, I'm not throwing shade at him. I'm not saying that's right or that's wrong. I mean, more power to you if that's what you want to do. That's great. And yet, when I hear this about his traveling gym, it actually sounds a whole lot like a temple, like a place of worship. Like, the Bible has a word for us when we worship something other than God. The simple word that the Bible has, if we worship something other than God, the word is idolatry. And so that's what we're going to take a look at today. We're going to peel the layers back and figure out what is worship, and are we engaging in worship, and are we truly worshiping the God, Yahweh, the one and only true God, or have we allowed idols to creep up onto the throne of our life? And we find ourselves worshiping these idols, or we'll actually find worse yet, we try to worship our idols and we try to worship God at the exact same time. Because that's where we are going. Because idolatry often causes us to go overboard in getting our felt needs met. Like seeking to get needs met, idolatry causes us to go overboard. And we're going to see through our passage today that if we're looking for anybody or anything else other than God to meet our needs, then our lives at best will be out of balance, and at worst will actually be in shambles. Because our life is a reflection of what we choose to worship, whether to our blessing or to our detriment. So today, my hope is we uncover some of the idols that might be lurking in our hearts and maybe identify some things that we didn't even recognize were idols in our heart. And so for us to be able to do this, I want to give us a little context on where we've been, just to be able to set the stage for this passage and show why I think this is one of the best passages that I love to not only consider, but to teach in all the Old Testament. So if you have a Bible with you, go ahead and turn to 1 Kings chapter 18. If you have a Bible, turn to 1 Kings 18. If you got a device has scriptures on it, go to 1 Kings chapter 18 and follow along with us. Or if you have the Mission Hills app, I encourage you to take that out. But here's what's happened to this point. And Pastor Craig has walked us through the last couple of weeks of this series. And I love the title of this series because the title of this series leads us perfectly into what we're talking about today. So to this point, you've got this prophet Elijah. He's a prophet of God. And you've got this king of Israel, this king of the northern kingdom of Israel. At this point, God's people came together. God rescued them out of Egypt. God created a kingdom for them. And yet the kingdom split because of some decisions that some certain leaders had made. There's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The southern kingdom at this point is called Judah. Judah stayed pretty faithful to God. The best they could, they stayed faithful to God and his commandments. The northern kingdom, they're out of whack. Like they have literally tried to almost it seems like they're doing everything God told them not to do. And there's this king in charge named King Ahab. Ahab was not a good dude. He was not a very good, faithful king to God. One of the things that God had commanded his people was not to intermarry with other cultures of the surrounding communities around Israel. It's not that God is against diversity. That's not at all it. God is all about diversity. God created diversity. The problem was when they would go in and they would intermarry with these different cultures, they would start to adopt some of the ways that they worship. And that's exactly what happened to King Ahab. So King Ahab goes and he marries a Canaanite woman. The Canaanites were this group of people. They're actually enemies of God. So Ahab goes and he marries this Canaanite woman. And this Canaanite woman worshiped one of the Canaanite gods was this god named Baal. Baal was the Canaanite god of fertility, the Canaanite god of rain and dew. So literally the god of life. And so King Ahab essentially brings in the worship of this idol, this false counterfeit lower G God, brings it into the people. So the people start being led away from worshiping the Lord and start worshiping Baal and looking at him as their source of life. Because again, he's the God of fertility. He's the God of the dew and the rain. But the interesting thing is as they start to worship this God Baal, this lowercase g God Baal, God stops the rain. That God actually stopped their supply, and sometimes God will stop our supply, as we studied the last couple of weeks. God will stop our supply just so that he can draw back our hearts and draw back our trust in him. So that's why this series is titled When the River Runs Dry. What happens when God stops providing for us in ways that we thought he was going to provide for us? And yet this series title, When the River Runs Dry, is fantastic as we talk about Elijah in this context of the rain stopping. But I want to take a different angle to this title. And the different angle is this. What happens when the river runs dry? What happens when the things that we allow to creep onto the throne of our lives that we worship, what happens when they stop providing the things that we wanted them to provide? Essentially, what happens when an idol stops providing and is insufficient in giving us what we want the idol to give us? So that's what we're going to take a look at, and that's where we're at. So before we continue, I just want to define a few terms. I want to define this term idolatry. What's our working definition of what an idol is? An idol can be called a whole lot of things. I wonder if in our mind we're thinking, okay, idolatry means little golden statues that we worship. And idolatry is much more than that. Here's a definition I want to work with this morning as we dive into this conversation. An idol is anything that begins to function as a substitute for God in our life. Like, I want us to really think about this. Anything that begins to function as a substitute for God in our life. Anything that consumes our heart, our thoughts, and our time. And that word consume is really important. You see, the seductive thing about idolatry is idolatry can actually be anything. An idol can be anything, even a good thing. Good things can become idols. See, here's the difference. An idol is a good thing that gets turned into an ultimate thing. You see the difference? Like there are some things in our lives that are really good, but they turn into idols. We start worshiping them when those good things actually get elevated to be ultimate things for us. And we move on from literally just being concerned about something, and we start to be consumed by it. Like it is good for us to worry about our health. It is good for us to be concerned about our health. That is a good thing. But yet when it starts to consume us, instead of just considering it or being concerned about it, when it starts to consume us, that's when it becomes an idol. Money is a good thing. God gave it. It is good to have a job. It's good to have a vocation. It's good to be able to provide. All of that is good. But when our vocation actually becomes a source of our identity, that's when it's become an ultimate thing. And so a lot of us might say, man, we don't worship idols because I don't have golden statues in my house. I belong to a Christian church, so naturally I don't worship idols. But again, the reality is an idol is something much deeper. You see, here's one of the dangerous things about idolatry is we're actually asking God to coexist with these other things in our lives. Like, that's the danger of this. There's an author and pastor, Tim Keller, that I enjoy reading every now and then. And I love what he says about idols. He says this: the greatest danger for Christians, people of God, the greatest danger for us is not that we become atheists. It's that we ask God to coexist with idols in our hearts. Like, that's one of the greatest dangers for us. So if an idol is something that begins to function as a substitute for us in our life, and we have a tendency to worship those things, let's take a look and see, well, what is worship? How are we viewing worship? Because we have to understand what worship truly is for us to identify what actually are the idols in our life. For many of us, I wonder if we would think that if we ask, hey, what is worship? Our statement would be something like the 20 minutes that we spend with music and singing before the pastor starts preaching in church. Like, that is worship. Like, that's a part of it, but that's not the entirety of it. And again, the definition I want us to work with today as we talk about this conversation in 1 Kings 18 is worship is giving ultimate worth or value to someone or something. It means bowing down, maybe not literally on our knees, but bowing our hearts, bowing our thoughts, bowing our soul to a person, a thing, or an idea. You see, at its core, let's just even take, for us to understand it a little bit, let's even take the 20 minutes that we spend singing before the message part of a church service. Let's just say that is worship. You see, here's what we believe as Christians, that God is the creator, that we are created in the image of God, that God creates, so literally all of our worth, all of our identity, all of our being, all of our security is found in God the creator. So in response to that, because we find our identity in him, we gather together and we sing in response to God. and we call that worship. Let's just say that's what that is. Even if we take that definition of worship, what we're saying is worship means that we are looking at something that gives us our worth, and we're expressing our appreciation or our attention toward that thing or that being or that deity. And so worship is any place you find yourself worshiping when you express gratitude or you're expressing something out of your heart towards something that you find your security in, that you find your identity in, and that you find your worth in. And so the problem for us is that we find ourselves not finding our full identity, not finding our source of belonging, not finding our security, not finding our peace in God Almighty. We go and we find those things in things of this world, like our jobs, our status. How many followers do we have? Am I taking the same kind of vacations as my friends are taking? Am I living in the same neighborhood? Are my kids going to those types of schools? Do my kids have those kinds of environments? Are they playing on those teams? What promotion am I getting? You see, all of those things are good. Those are good things. But when they become ultimate things, or worse yet, when we start to find our identity in those things, that's when they become damaging for us. And here's why this is so important for us. When God set his people apart, when he brought them out of Egypt and he established them in the land that he had set aside for them, he gave them a number of commandments. Jesus was even asked thousands of years after. Jesus was asked, hey, of all the prophets, all the laws, all the commandments, what is the greatest one? And Jesus hearkens back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. And Deuteronomy 6:5 is the commandment that all the other laws and commandments are based upon this one. And here's what Deuteronomy 6:5 says. And this is why it's so important for us to understand that the seductive nature of idolatry can pull us away from God. Because God says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and with all of your strength. Like the key phrase, the key word in that passage is the word all. A-L-L. And I want you to think about this. What are some things in your life that you've given your all to? Like, I'll be honest, there's not a lot, if any, if I was being really honest. Like, I'm really good at giving some to things in my life. I've actually gotten really good at giving a lot to things in my life. But I wonder, have I ever really put myself in a place where I've given my all to something, let alone God himself? And here's why this commandment was so important. That God was sharing this with a culture, with a group of people who lived in a time in the human history where there was a lot of polytheistic worship. It's just a fancy way of saying that people had a whole bunch of different gods. And we can even think back to our schooling, and some of the students, you're studying some of this right now in school with the Greek gods and the Egyptian gods, that it was very normal for a group of people to have multiple gods that they worshiped. But Yahweh, the God, the Lord, tells his people, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Worship one God and give him your all. Do not share your worship with anybody else. You know what this was intended to do? This was actually intended to set God's people apart from all the other nations and all the other people groups. Because all the other people groups actually felt great about worshiping and finding their identity in all these different types of gods. And God said, no, my people are not to be that way. My people are to find their fulfillment, their security, and their peace in me and me only. And it was actually supposed to be a marker and a way of expression that set his people apart from the rest of the world. And it's no different than today. So that's why it's really important for us to identify what are the idols that we've allowed to creep up in our life. Where are we finding our security, our worth, and our identity from? Because the reality is we are wired to worship. And so that's where we find ourselves, and that's why this is such an important piece for us. If I was being very honest with y'all, for a lot of my life, football was my idol. Like, it was like, that's where I found, that even in college, especially in college, that's where I found my identity, my friends, my security. Everything was found in this game of football. Even though I'd met Jesus as a college athlete, even though I was starting to be discipled and learning how to walk with him, I remember myself praying a prayer very similar to this. And I'm like even embarrassed saying this, but like this is literally how the prayer went. God, if you make me good at football, I will go all out for you. Like, that's what it looked like. Like, I wanted so desperately for God to make me good at this thing because I wanted to be known as somebody that was good at this thing. And thankfully, in his graciousness, he did not answer that prayer because I was no good at football. And I'm thankful that he didn't answer that. And I'm thankful that the Lord knew I was tripping when I prayed a prayer like that because I wonder if he would have answered that prayer if I would have even learned to trust him throughout the rest of my life. And I wish I could tell you it just ended in college. I wish I could blame it on being in college and all my concussions and all of that, but I can't. After I was done playing, I was coaching for a while, coached in college, then ended up in ministry, and I was a pastor. I was a local church pastor for 12 years. And that's what I did. That was my identity. That's what people knew me as a local church pastor. I was a college pastor, and then we planted a church. That was the title, pastor. And I've shared some of my story here. We had a pretty hard split, breakup, leadership disagreements with the church we were at. So my wife and I ended up resigning. And I remember sitting on the pool deck of our neighborhood. Our kids were young at the time. It was about this time of year. It was about mid-June when this happened. And we're sitting on the pool deck one morning because our kids are in swim lessons. And I look at my wife and I say these words: if I'm not a pastor, like, what am I? Like, I literally had no idea what my identity would be apart from this job, this vocation that I had. And I wonder if you've been there. And I wonder, even as I'm talking right now, that we're recognizing, man, there are some things that I have allowed to creep up on the throne of my life. That even as we think about these definitions, we think about what are some things that we've crept up, good things, that we've actually allowed to be ultimate things. What about our religion? Sometimes the way that we act or the way that we talk or what church we attend or how we dress, or we don't say certain words and other people say certain words, or we read the Bible a certain way, or we vote a certain way and we align ourselves with one party or another. Sometimes that can be an idol. Again, it's a good thing that ends up becoming an ultimate thing. Asking God to coexist with all these things and asking God to be provider alongside of all of these other things. Do you see the danger in all this? And that's where we find ourselves here. So we're going to take a look at 1 Kings chapter 18, and this is the danger that Elijah saw that the people were doing. That they were worshiping Baal, this fertility god, this Canaanite foreign god, this god of fertility, this god of the dew and the rain, that they were worshiping this god alongside of trying to worship Yahweh. In a way, they were trying to cover their bases. And what Elijah's about to say is, actually, you're not even on base. Like, you can't have it both ways. It's only one way or another. So in 1 Kings 18, Pastor Craig walked us through. He started the series for us, this part of the series last week. So what happens is Elijah gets empowered. He gets over some of his fears. He sees God working in some certain ways. And he goes to a man named Obadiah. Obadiah is the assistant to King Ahab. Remember, King Ahab, bad guy, brings in, the worship of Baal and actually hates the prophets of God and wants to kill all the prophets of the Lord. And so Elijah goes to Obadiah, who is the king's assistant, and Obadiah is a follower of the Lord. He's actually protecting the Lord's prophets. And Elijah goes to Obadiah and says, hey, I've got to talk to the king. And Obadiah is like, you've got to what? Like, no, you don't. Like, don't you understand? He wants to kill you. And Elijah's like, nope, it's okay. God's about to do something. I need to have a conversation with Ahab. So that's where we left off last week. So we pick up 1 Kings 18, verse 16. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab. So again, Obadiah, the assistant, went to meet King Ahab, and he told him, hey, Elijah wants to talk to you. And Ahab went out to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you, troubler of Israel? I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. You've abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all of Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Like, there's some really interesting stuff here. First of all, he shows up to the king. Like, he shows up to the king. And the king's like, hey, troubler of Israel. And this prophet's like, man, I'm no troubler of Israel. You're a troubler of Israel. And so is your daddy. Like, he's a troubler of Israel too. Like, you can see the tension starting to like mount. And then he says, hey, actually, why don't you bring all the prophets of Baal? It's time for a showdown. Like, it's time to settle the score. Why don't you bring them on? Let's settle it on Mount Carmel. Like, we might look at that and be like, okay, that's just some geographical location. Mount Carmel was actually nicknamed God's vineyard because it was the most fertile land in all of Israel. Like, Mount Carmel is referenced most often as a symbol of beauty and fertility. Do you know what another nickname for Mount Carmel was? The mountain of Baal, because of its fertility and because of its moisture. Like, don't miss this. Elijah was like, man, there's gonna be a showdown and we're coming to your town. Like, we're gonna do it on your home court. We're gonna do it on your home field, your home ice. Like, this is where we're going. And he's like, hey, I'm willing to play an away game for all the marbles. And so they gather together on Mount Carmel, and then Elijah looks at him, and in verse 21, the scripture says, Elijah went before all the people that were assembled, all the prophets of Baal, and he says this, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. Like, they are paralyzed. They don't know what to say. And Elijah lays it all out. He's like, look, let's just settle the score right now. If the Lord is God, if Yahweh is God, why don't we just follow him? But if Baal is God, great, let's go ahead and follow him as well, and let's go. So here's what the problem is. Elijah's exposing this problem, that their worship was divided. And he's calling them to choose between the living God or this counterfeit, lowercase g, God. You know, in the phrase that he uses when he says, how long will you waver between two opinions? That was a phrase that was used in the Hebrew. And the phrase meant something like limping between two different opinions. Literally saying you are powerless. It was a phrase used to talk about, he's basically saying you're spiritually disabled. Because you can't have strength if you try to put your trust in both. It's like trying to align yourself with two teams that are rivals. It's a lot like this picture right here. Take a look at this picture of this shirt right here up on the screens. It's like, some people look at that and be like, man, I have no idea what that means. Let me explain what that means. So Michigan, University of Michigan is on the left, that blue and yellow. Like, those are the Wolverines. They call them, they're the University of Michigan, big dogs. They've got, 100,000 plus seat football stadium. The one on the right is the state school in green, which I like state schools that wear green. That's Michigan State, so Michigan State is actually their biggest rival. You don't see very many people wearing this shirt walking around Detroit. Like, you don't do that because you can't be a fan of one team by claiming the other. And this is what Elijah was saying. Elijah was saying, hey, you cannot worship both. You can't worship two things at the same time. You can't cover all your bases because when you do, you're actually not even on base. It kind of goes back to some of the words that Joshua back in Exodus in the book of Joshua says when he says, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. And I wonder, even as we talk about this passage, even as we continue on in this passage and find out what the showdown looks like, I wonder if God is just knocking on our heart. And he's saying, hey, would you choose? Like, just make a choice. Choose for yourself this day whom you are going to serve. And so Elijah is challenging the people's divided worship, but they respond with silence. Why were they silent? I wonder if they're silent for the same reasons you and I get silent when we start exposing some of the idols in our lives. Because in every part of us, I wonder if we're at a place where we say, man, I really want to trust the Lord. I really want to trust God with my relationship. I really want to trust God on whether or not I get married. I really want to trust God with my job or whatever it is. But I just can't see God, but I can see this. And so it's easier for me to put my trust in this. And I wonder if that's a place where their silence was. And yet this is where faith and trust come in, because the world will say, culture and the world says, hey, show me first, show me the proof, and then I'll trust. That's what the world says. God actually says, man, trust me, and then I'll show you. They were looking for God to show up first, and God says, man, would you just trust me, and then I will show you. And the thing is, God deserves wholehearted worship directed towards him alone. But he's not going to force us to worship him. He invites us, and he gives us a choice. So in verse 22, we pick up the scene on Mount Carmel. On verse 22, it says, then Elijah said to them, remember all the prophets are gathered there, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves. Let them cut it in pieces and put it on the wood, but don't set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but I won't set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. Like, let's go. Let's get it on. Like, the scene is set. The pay-per-view event is on. The octagon has been set up. The rules of engagement. Like, this is what's going to happen. There is going to be a showdown. And it's an away game for Elijah and God. See, these idols, what we're going to find is these idols are deceptive, because counterfeits don't ultimately deliver what they promise. So here's what happens. In verse 25, it continues. The writer continues, says, Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls, prepare it first, and there's so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but don't light the fire. So they took the bull given to them, and they prepared it. And they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. So no one answered. No one paid attention. And then at verse 27, this is where it gets really good. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Hey, shout louder. Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he's traveling. Maybe he's sleeping. And you've got to wake him up. Like, dude, Elijah's literally talking trash on their home court. Like, he's calling them out. And it's like this reality where it's almost like the author says, no one answered, no one paid attention. And their friends he'd worship. Like, there's crickets. I wonder if it's like Elijah sitting there. He's like, where's he at? Is God not going to show up? I'll wait. I got plenty of time. Oh, he's asleep. Maybe he's asleep. Yeah, let's go ahead and wake him up. All right, I'll go ahead and wait. Like, oh, wait, he's not coming? Like, that's kind of awkward, isn't it? Like, Elijah's getting to this place where he starts to get a little bit bold with talking to them. And what he's doing is he's actually applying human characteristics to this God that they seemingly thought was deity. And in verse 28, it gets better. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice. But there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. There's a couple of dichotomies that we see about idols just in that little passage. First one is this: idols are silent, but they still speak to us because we allow them to. Idols are silent. 5 times they called on Baal to come and to show up, but no one answered their call for help. Another reality about idols is idols are powerless, but we still allow them to be strong. You'll see the prophets call on Baal to display his power with fire to consume the sacrifice at the altar, but Baal did not have the power to do what the people wanted him to do. Friends, this is the truth of our idols. That our idols and the things we actually worship are incapable of giving us the security and the peace and the worth and the identity that we want them to. Football was incapable of loving me back the way that I wanted it to love me back. Relationships, vocations, vacations, job, houses, titles, promotions, all of that stuff is incapable of providing for us what only the Lord Almighty was intended to provide for us. Ultimate security, ultimate value, and ultimate identity. And lastly, idols are deadly, but they still promise life. Isn't it interesting? This Canaanite god Baal was the god of life, god of fertility. And yet they were slashing themselves with swords, literally killing themselves to worship this God that seemingly was supposed to give them life. And we might say to ourselves, well, that's pretty extreme. Like, good thing I don't do that. Man, I have watched people work themselves into the ground with 60, 70, 80-hour weeks to expand a business so that they would be seen a certain way. Tell me that's not sacrificing our health on the altar of idol worship. Or literally, what if I've watched people literally harm their bodies and starve themselves just so that they could look a certain way to impress a certain person so that maybe they'll get some security and identity from that. But unfortunately, that never works out either. Or we buy things with money we don't have to impress people we don't even like. And we buy things we don't even need. And we do this so that we'd be seen a certain way. But reality is, that can never love us back the way that we want it to love us. So what should our response be? What does it look like for us? Here's where it starts. Daily surrender. Starts with daily surrender, believing that God is supreme and worthy of my continual submission. We're going to find that the Lord does show up when we invite him to. Verse 30, it continues. Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me," and they came to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down during their crazy worshiping and dancing and cutting themselves. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a third time," he ordered, and they did it a third time. Like he was drenching this altar. He was drenching the sacrifice because he knew that God was going to show up. Verse 35, the water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham," listen to this prayer, "the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel. I am your servant. I've done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord." He doesn't say answer me for my benefit. He says answer me so these people will know that you, Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again. So he builds this altar. And there's some great takeaways to read from Elijah's prayer because he was pointing everything back and everyone back to God Almighty. So he calls on the name of the Lord. He calls on the Lord. And verse 40 tells us that Elijah verse 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and it also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and they cried, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." So God shows up. And God comes to this place, and actually I believe what God was wanting the people to see, it wasn't just running away from their idols. He wanted them to run to him. So it's not just about running away from things, it's about running actually back to him because he is our source. And in verse 40 and 41, he continues. And it says, "Then Elijah commanded them, saying, seize the prophets of Baal, because they were leading God's people astray. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. And Elijah said to Ahab, the king, listen to this. He says to the king, "Go eat and drink." Basically, go have a celebration. "For there is the sound of a heavy rain." So God ends up sending the rain. And don't miss when God ended up sending the rain after the drought. I wonder if there's this picture that God is wanting to invite us into. That when we get to a place where we're courageous enough to not just identify the idols that we're worshiping, but also cleanse our hearts and our souls of those idols and declare like they did, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord is a source of my security. The Lord is a source of my identity. The Lord is a source of my worth." That when they got to a place where they declared that, God's blessings came through. I wonder if there's a place for us that we have asked God to coexist with all these idols that are in our lives. And I wonder if that has clouded our perspective of God and maybe even prevented him from being able to show up and to bless in the ways that he's wanted to bless us. Not because he's mean and not because he's holding out, but because our worship is divided. And this is where Jesus steps in, because this is where following Jesus changes everything. In John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus says, I am the source of your identity. I am the source of everything that this world is going to try to promise you. I am the one that will lead you to the Father. He also said the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And one of the chief strategies of the thief is to distract us with these idols. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus says, I have come that they might have life, and not just regular life, abundant life. I wonder if the abundant life is available, I know the abundant life is available for each and every one of us, but I wonder if it's being clouded because we haven't settled where our ultimate source of worth is coming from. That we've tried to get our worth and our identity from how many people follow us on social media. Students, I get it. I see what you all are experiencing online and what we see, and I understand how tempting it is to go and find security in other places. But can I encourage you to remember that you have been created on purpose and for a purpose? You've been created with the imprint of the Holy One upon your hearts. And even though this world has tried to mar it, even though this world has tried to twist it, doesn't change the fact that you have been forged by God and formed for his purpose. You don't need to pursue these idols to gain life. Life is already available. And just as I'm talking to students, I'm talking to every single one of us that tend to find our security in other places. You know, I'm just gonna paraphrase the rest of chapter 18. So Elijah goes and he tells Ahab, hey, go eat, drink, go have a party. Let's celebrate. We've been at odds with one another. But let's celebrate because the idols, the idolatry of our nation, it's getting cleansed. And God's gonna pour down rain. So Ahab goes on a trip, and God calls Elijah to go on this trip as well. And what we're gonna find next week, the problem with Elijah, even though God was able to do something miraculous through him, Elijah finds himself in a place where he actually gets ahead of God's calling in his life, which ends up being a problem for him. But again, you have to come back next week for us to talk about that. Would you stand and join me in prayer as we close out? Father Almighty, thank you for your grace. Thank you that even, Lord, now you are reminding many of us of the little g God counterfeits, idols that we have allowed ourselves to find our identity in. And Lord, right now, in this moment, as we sing this last song, we choose to repent. We choose to say we are choosing to follow you, to find the source of our life in you and not a source of our life in the things that this world says we got to find the source of our life. And you are supreme. You are the rainmaker and you are the giver of all good things. And we look to you. Thank you for drawing our hearts back to you and for flipping us from a life that worships multiple things to a life that finds its security in the one who gave his life for us. Amen.